The supreme commander of the Allied forces in France was General Maurice Gamelin. He was aloof and felt ill at ease amongst his troops. He preferred to spend his time at his headquarters, cut off from the men. In May 1940, Gamelin's command was made up of 4 operational areas. The most important of these was in the northeast, facing Germany. Gamelin retained direct control of planning and strategy, leaving his frontline commanders in charge of operations and liaisons with each other. It was a desperately flawed command structure, characterized by inefficient coordination and communication. To make matters worse, Gamelin had fallen out with his key commanders. The BEF commander, Lord John Gort, was disturbed by the blatant weakness of the French command structure, but as he was subordinate to Gamelin, he could do little about it. Gamelin had been a staff officer during the First World War, and the strategies of that era still dominated his outlook. He believed that infantry still reigned supreme on the battlefield. He discounted the idea that tanks, on their own, could breach a continuous line of defense. As the lessons of the Polish campaign were pondered, he confidently asserted that his forces could contain and cut off any possible breakthrough by panzers. Gamelin's passive strategy infuriated France's new Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, who called him a nerveless philosopher. Twice in April, and again on the very eve of the German invasion, he tried to have Gamelin dismissed. However, each time the general's political supporters had stepped in to save him. France's fate would now rest in his hands. By May 1940, 94 French divisions, containing 2.25 million men, were deployed to meet the expected German attack. However, much of their artillery dated from the First World War, and they were dangerously short of effective anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns. French and British tactical doctrine regarding tanks and aircraft lagged far behind the Germans. Both the high commands considered tanks as first and foremost an infantry support weapon. The few French armoured divisions formed by 1940 contained only half as many tanks as their German counterparts. Between them, the Allies deployed 3,100 tanks in May 1940, but they were widely dispersed amongst the infantry divisions. As for the French Air Force, it could field only 740 modern fighters and 140 effective light or medium bombers. These were reinforced by 350 aircraft from Britain's RAF, attached to the BEF. The Allied aircraft were dispersed amongst the different areas of the front in just the same way as the armoured forces were. This made it impossible for individual army commanders to obtain a sufficient concentration of air power at the right moment. This shortcoming would be one of the major factors in the outcome of the Battle of France. The French Army's standard light tank from 1935, the R-35, was used in an infantry support role. 855 R-35s equipped the army in May 1940, making it France's most numerous tank. Extremely slow, it was unsuitable for mobile strategic operations. Like all French tanks, its effectiveness was limited by the fact that its commander had also to act as gunner, loader, and radio operator. First developed in the mid-1930s, the Char B was a formidable weapon, with thicker armour than any Panzer. It mounted a 47mm gun in a revolving turret, backed up by a 75mm gun in the hull. Though limited by a short operating range of 85 miles, the Char B could cope with any German tank pitted against it. Like other French tanks, it was poorly deployed by the Army Command. The Matilda II would prove to be the best British tank in the Battle of France. It was one of the earliest tanks to have a hydraulically controlled turret. Designed purely for infantry support, its cross-country speed was little faster than walking pace. The Matilda was the best protected tank of its day, but it suffered somewhat from poor vision and mobility. During the interwar years, the French army was regarded as the most formidable in Europe. By 1939, this reputation no longer stood up to close scrutiny. Throughout the 1930s, recruitment had fallen and funding declined due to the Depression and the large costs of the Maginot Line. The troops received only 50 centimes a day, compared to a British private's daily allowance of 17 francs. This caused great resentment amongst the French rank and file. Their living conditions were uncomfortable and impoverished. Discipline was lax, with soldiers often neglecting to salute their officers, and even leaving their barracks each weekend without permission. Many of the officers did their level best to secure a posting far behind the lines, away from the dreariness and danger of the front. The winter of 1939 was the coldest in 50 years, making life at the front harsher still. Training and work routines were curtailed, which gave rise to idleness and then boredom. Amongst the BEF, where the officers insisted on keeping their men busy, morale was a good deal better. Their months of waiting were spent improving defence works and completing the training of the recently raised territorial army units. For the French soldiers, however, their army's ingrained defensive strategy added to its inertia and further sapped their fighting spirit. On May the 10th, the French army would go into battle with a fatal mix of apathy and disharmony.